begin?
No, it's okay. You can.
Okay.
And
So,
Paolo, you can have the full screen.
Okay, doing right now. Wait. Can you? Yeah, should be fine.
Perfect.
Now. Okay.
So, welcome to all of you. I'm happy to be today with Paolo Ruspini for a conference at this Déjeuners sociologiques on the way migration and mobility could be better understand with new kind of theoretical orientations. It's a theoretical and empirical inspired conference that we are expected from you, that you announced, and so we'll be happy to hear you.
Okay.
You have more or less 40 minutes to present your points, and then I will make some comments, and we will open as soon as possible the discussion to the whole group. So happy to be with you and with the others clearly too. And I give you the floor now for the beginning of this conference. Perhaps if you can say something about you, what you are doing in this moment, and it would be nice from the research point of view. I know that you are father now too, but that's more interesting for other situations than this one. Okay, up to you, Paolo.
No, my little son is alive and kicking anyway, and particularly when he's not at the kindergarten. Closing this window, I recently joined a new co-session dealing with female migration in historical perspective. And I joined it as member of the management board for Switzerland, together with another colleague from the University of Bern, Francesca Falk. And so it's very interesting because it matches the historical perspective with contemporary female migration. Then I've been doing research evaluation, as usual, quite a lot, coming soon, also for the European Commission, on integration project, and usually the Marie Curie Fellowship for the Horizon 2020 program. And then I've been teaching a class, a master class online for an Hungarian university. It was Lorand. It was quite challenging. It's nice. And we are approaching the mid of this class. And it's about migration memory and identities. That's it. This is a topic that I'm going to talk today, that I developed also into a short monograph, which is Migrant Unbound, for the Transnational Press London. And it's a collection of small piece of research and papers that I mainly unpublished, but I developed it along 10 years when in southern Switzerland for different projects. So, so here where all the issue I'm going to discuss today come from. But anyway, I've been using a transnational framework and now a transnational approach to migration for more than 10 years. So, and today I'm linking the transnational perspective to return migration, because I'm involved also in IMISCO, in a research group dealing with return migration, and also transnational migration before. Now they changed it also the name of this cluster. So two groups dealing with the issue I'm going to discuss today. And the idea of this paper is to give you a theoretical framework, and then adding some evidences from former field work, and just comparing all these evidences at the end. So let me move on now. Yeah. So can I close? Migration was for a long time conceived as the one-way movement, particularly in the 19th century. And this is not the full reality, but we will discuss about it. So it was conceptualized as permanent, particularly in rural-urban framework, with movement in one direction toward the urban centers. You could think also about Ravenstein and low migration and so on. But this is Melch, who is an anthropologist. And today, instead, migratory patterns include fluid, heterogeneous dynamics like circular transit and return migration, and also the resulting transnational configuration. And then as far as transnational migration, first of all, we have to cope with what scholars call it methodological nationalism, which was the way migration studies has been permeated for a long time. And the way researchers understood the social reality and producing nation-based research. And I'm afraid this is really a future of a lot of research dealing with migration of different kinds. But what was new at the end of the 90s, so basically it's 20 years now that this framework, migrant transnationalism, has been used. And together we've been used, it brought to the fore, either first in the USA, then in Europe, a new perspective, linking different localities and also challenging narrow nation-oriented approaches, the one I put forward by the criticism, by the methodological nationalism. And then if we look at what is transnationalism, as I said, is something not new, because no matter the idea about the permanent migration of the 19th century, we need to think about, and there is a research dating back to the 70s, I will mention later on, but even transatlantic migrants, let's think about Italians in the US, keep along their lifetime a connection with their home. And once in a lifetime, they were also able to come back. There are a lot of evidences of the kind of transnational practices keep, no matter, I mean, considering the times, the possibility in terms of technological and travel terms. But what is new is nowadays is that migration, because of the different possibility offered by IT technologies and by the possibility to travel, and so by globalization process in the large extent, really changing the way we can think about it. But anyway, there is also reference here to Randolph Burr, who was one of the first to conceptualize, to think about America as a transnational nation, composed of and constantly changed through immigration from diverse origins. And today, we need to give a definition of transnationalism, and we should think about ties that migrants keep with source country, and not only with source country, but also with other countries. So thinking about a dynamic perspective of migration. And Faist help us in this regard, putting attention on the time and space compression, which create a transnational social spaces. And we will see later on what Faist already 20 years ago meant with transnational social spaces. Portes, so sociologists on one side and anthropologists on the other, were the first one initiating transnational migration. So here I just quoted Portes, who argued that while back and forth movements by immigrants have always existed, they have not acquired until recently the critical mass and complexity necessary to speak of an emergent social field, pointing out to a growing number of persons who live dual lives, speaking 2 languages, having homes in 2 countries, and making a living through continuous regular contact across national borders. And we reference, obviously at the time, Portes, Landau, Guernizo looking at the US migration system, the Mexican-US migration system, and looking at the transformation of this migration system, and looking at the way Mexican migrants got step by step, slowly incorporated also into the American society, American reality. So not easily, as we can imagine, but at the same time, they looked at the patterns they kept with the home country. So transnational migration patterns, according to the scholars, result when both the return pool of sending communities and the retaining power of receiving economies are high. So there are both the push and pull factors typical of the early conceptualization of migration, still economical perspective, what a scholar considers. This initial perspective emphasizes the economic dimension. Portes is an economic sociologist of transnational, but later on, the discussion got broader and encompassed also political and sociocultural factors. And here I use it a conceptualization that they made, which was also updated later on by our scholar based at the University of Amsterdam by Lisa Mugge, which included other categories. But this is the original conceptualization they made. So they divided the three sectors. We can think about the transnational migration, the economical, political, and sociocultural factors, and then at the level of institutionalization, which can be low or high, as long as the agencies pertains to migrants or where institutions of different kind, you can see from also multinational companies or banks, when we talk about remittances. And when we think about agency, we have example of informal cross-country traders in Europe. We can think about the transition time after 1989 for Central Eastern European economies, for the Central Eastern European states belonging until that time to the Soviet bloc, and the way cross-border trade started to develop once the border were opened, for instance, in between Poland and Ukraine. There was at the beginning of shuttle migration and so on. But we have also similar example in the south. If we think about Algerians selling their stuff in places in harbor city like Marseille, so and keeping this kind of circulation patterns in a kind of post-colonial perspective in this regard. Then we have the political perspective, and this is also very interesting if we think about issue I'm trying to summarize now, like dual nationalities and the way transnational communities and diaspora has been used either by home or receiving countries. If we think about nowadays Turkey and the way Erdogan was trying to use the few millions of Turkish people, third generation there as a potential electoral base. This is a typical example of, but if we think about Switzerland and looking at the bottom of this slide, immigrant elected to home country legislature is a reality, thinking again about the Italian community in Switzerland. Or if we switch to the last sectors, the sociocultural sector, we have obviously a relevant example and also in empirical terms, if we think about Orthodox priest, but also imam, keeping connection with their parishioners in case of the priest at home. And there are examples of nowadays in Europe and empirical studies on this issue. But also from the institutional point of view, the involvement of embassy or consulate, like the Swiss consulate in Milan or the embassy in Rome organizing events, and so keeping this kind of transnational practices across border. There is a lot to say, but we look now at the definition of Faist, which is also very useful later on for my conceptualization of return migration. What does Faist mean with transnational social spaces? Basically, a combination of social and symbolic ties, positioning network, and organization that can be found in at least 2 geographically and international distinct places. And he looked at 3 types of transnational social spaces, like kinship groups, where remittances fall into, characterized by ties of reciprocity, then transnational circuits, like the trading networks or trading activities I mentioned before, and transnational communities, which are predicated on the solidarity derived from a sharing conception of collective identity. And we move on issue of identity. And Kivisto, another scholar who also at the beginning criticized the transnational approach and contributed also to its development, just point out that any of these ties contain, however, an affective element. It can be reciprocity, trust, and so on. And that's, on my side, an example of remittances and what kind of fund center that allow migrants to keep ties and to move resources and money across border. And this is typical of kinship group. Let's give a short example. If we think about Moldova, remittances, so in Europe, one of the poorest countries in Europe, are even higher than the development aid in terms of money transferred by Moldovan migrants abroad, particularly in different locations across Europe. Then a last point on transnationalism pertain to, which is really at the forefront of current research, how to cope with incorporation processes when we think about this kind of dynamic framework, and particularly when time of migration passed by. And there was actually a scope for criticism, and other criticism also pertaining to the theoretical focus on national and ethnic identities and failure to link migrant local and transborder connection to new flexible mode of capital accumulation, and particularly in the current neoliberal restructuring, as Glick-Schiller said, of space, self, and mode of social legitimation. But time and space in migration can challenge the seemingly binary opposite of transnationalism versus integration, raising question on the durability of transnational ties and the way integration and transnationalism influence each other. So this is, as I said, it's really at the forefront of current research with different empirical studies going on in several locations. And Otske Vilgili remind us that the present research at the end of the day say that different form of belonging, so acknowledge a different form of belonging and simultaneous embeddedness in multiple societies. So there is no in and out final conclusion on the dyadic transnationalism integration, but a coexistence of both these phenomena. And we, after this short introduction on transnational migration, we look now at return migration, and then we link return migration to transnational migration. And what do we mean by return migration? There are German scholars that talked about remigration. Return migration usually is used in case of a migrant return to his country of origin after having passed a significant time span abroad. And the United Nations definition make a distinction between a permanent, when we talk about international migration, between permanent and short-term migration, temporary migration, less than 1 year. And the Migrazione de Retour au Maghreb project run by Jean-Pierre Cassarino at the European University Institute in Florence who is one of the most prolific scholars dealing with the history of return migration, identified the personal dimension of return migration by seeing a returnee as any person returning to their country of origin in the course of the last 10 years. So they use it basically, the United, they built up on the former United Nations definition after being an international migrant, whether short-term or long-terms in another country. And return, here where also transnational, and the transnational framework comes to the forefront. Return may be permanent or temporary, and may be independently decided by the migrant, or obviously forced also by unexpected circumstances. So there is a distinction, obviously, we need to keep into consideration about expulsion on one side, so involuntary return and voluntary return on the other side, or incentive also for returners. Let me give you an example. During the financial crisis back in 2008, it was a socialist government in Europe. I'm afraid the Zapatero government at the time, with the collapse of the state business, to invite through a check of, if I remember correctly, 500 euro, some of the Latin America, so some of the post-colonial migration or other type of migration in Spain to return home because there were no jobs anymore there. And it did not work, as many of our these return framework are not always very effective, or at least to the extent they expected to solve the unemployment rising in Spain at the time of the financial crisis and then economic crisis. Return migration overall is a multifaceted and heterogeneous phenomenon, and is still relatively new on the European research agenda. Although, I mean, the European Commission has been pointing out the issue for some good time, also developing a kind of large program on the issue. And it's set for historical consideration on return migration from the New World. It's what I mentioned before, in the first decade of the last century. And this is the research of Cherazze, of Italian migrants in the US. And that's where I referred before about transnational patterns, although obviously limited by the possibility of the time. And the short-term interest in remigration of Southern European guest workers in the 1960s and 70s, still it's an underrated research field of European migration. And here I refer obviously to also to the history of migration in Switzerland. And we will come back on the issue again. Return at the end of the day is very difficult to estimate, because there are few countries that keep data on people leaving. And there are lack of comparable data on outgoing person, as Russell King and again Melch remind us. This is a picture I took while I was giving a seminar back in 2014 at the University of Osnabrück at the Institute of Research on Migration and Intercultural Studies. And it's about memories of Italian labor migrants returning home, as you can see from the plaque on the train. And now the third part of this presentation will cover the link between transnational and return migration, so to better conceptualize where I'm going, and then to start to think about a number of research questions that I raised and also try to answer in the Migrant Unbound book. So the first question is how to relate migrant transnationalism and return migration, how the two relate to each other. The second is what is the unique contribution of social networks and transnationalism to comprehend return migration. If we look at a migration theory book, social networks come to the forefront when also studying transnational migration and the contribution of social networks in this regard. And last but not least, what migration theory can learn from few examples coming from empirical research. So the introduction of a transnational approach somehow allows to go beyond a purely ethnic or essentialist perspective on return migration, Since with the transnational perspective, return is not at the end of migration cycle, looking at the link between home and host countries and between other countries where mobile migrants or mobile people are. So it's not the end of the migration cycle, but with the return, the migration process continues thanks to the transnational perspective. So it's just one stage of the migration process. So we are not looking at into deterministic aspects, but we look at in dynamic framework. In other words, the binary structural vision of cross-border movement is questioned, as I anticipated, taking into account the circularity of migration movement, which obviously facilitate migrant mobilities. And this is even dated back as pointed to 1984 to Chapman and Prothero research. The second point is that on this we will come back again in the final session of this presentation. Social network, as I say, that provide an important addendum in understanding return migration. Social network by Granovetter are defined as ties or connection, either weak or strong ties between individuals that vary in strength, type, and duration. In view of Bourdieu, social network as social capital represent the potential resources, such, for instance, help in finding a job, financial or even moral help to be activated. And belonging to a group give access to a network, but obviously the access to specific resources depends on the individual and is their position in the network. That's what Bourdieu reminds us. And obviously the maintenance of linkages between receiving and origin country, as stressed by the transnational framework, foster the ability of migrants to prepare and secure their own return. So to also rely on social capital that allows to make a successful return, which is not always the case, as we will see later. Cross-border network of social and economic relationship secure and sustain return migration. This is actually from the research we ran from in between on transnational patterns of migration between Bulgaria and Switzerland. And in particular, we looked at also the circulation and return migration in an article, which is also mentioned inside here. So the question that I raised is, because of the framework I stressed, can we say that migrants are really unbound? And if we look at sample of migrants per different age, class, education, obviously we have different and diverse trajectories in terms of transnational practices and also return migration. For instance, back in 2009, I was running research for the Council of Europe, and it was an assessment of a number of countries on the issue of elderly migrants. And then I focused particularly on 3 countries in a kind of triangulation, which are Switzerland, Sweden, and Serbia, which are bound also by different kind of migration flows. And anyway, generally speaking, and looking at what was said about Sweden, research on elderly migrants demonstrate that transnational and circular patterns of migration, particularly for non-European migrants in Sweden, are often a viable alternative to the high cost involved in return in light of the absence of a proper pension. So that was stigmatized by this research. The lack of a proper pension implied then circular and transnational patterns of migration for non-Europeans in Sweden. And the time spent in Switzerland exhibits similar circulation or temporary residence in the country of origin. For the former guest workers, was permanent return remain, as we know, largely fictive, and nurturing what was called so by Sita Phoebe and her research on the myth of return, particularly when she was looking at second generation, and so on, which is the bunch of research on the history. Transnational patterns on migration and circulation as a viable alternative to the difficulties in making a return possible, also because the time of migration passed by. Many of these migrants were somehow integrated into the social fabric of the receiving countries, although, as we know, we need to use some caveat on the issue. But anyway, time-space compression made community without propinquity possible, according to Faist, particularly if we think about moving from elderly migrants to the connection, communication, and transfer of knowledge for categories of migrants as the highly skilled or both highly educated second generation, and the use of social network and so on and so forth, and the possibility also for, COVID time as an exception, obviously, because this is open another parenthesis on what we are saying. But anyway, these are, generally speaking, quite mobile group. Also mobile, also in IT terms. And this spatial configuration are a paramount feature of the current era, comparing to the unidirectional and permanent migration of the former century. They potentially allow, potentially allow migrant rights and identity negotiation and renegotiation across borders. Again, we are talking about the highly skilled. So the question is, do similar configuration of community without propinquity in time and spatial terms, as stressed by Faist, make the contemporary migrants unbound? Well, if we think about economy in economical and political terms, the answer is rather negative when borders and different boundaries are considered. And here I mentioned it, I stressed it, the results of our almost 4 years of research, looking at different aspects of migration between Switzerland and Bulgaria, including the role of social inequalities and regional disparities. So not only the transnational, which was the main framework we adopted, the transnational framework. So for my mixing method research, because we ran a quite exhaustive quantitative studies and then a selective qualitative research in different areas of Switzerland. So this research proved that class and education still perpetuate selective inequalities, particularly for the less skilled migrants who live on transnational practices as remittances and tend to circulate between their home and destination country with no final return on the horizon. And this is the reference goes particularly to Bulgarian Roma, who actually showed this kind of these patterns of circulation. And also, we need to think about the impact of the selective migration policies that Switzerland has been adopted. And circular migration as a way to, to help the households at home, and the kind of strategy to make their hands meet for these less privileged migrants, as the one we intercepted, like as I said, Bulgarian Roma, but also Bulgarian Turks, for instance, which is a minority with a long history in the contest. So at last, we can say that similar categories of low-skilled and vulnerable migrants nowadays represent a chip-level reservoir in the current neoliberal era, and or are currently live as a kind of underclass in terms of civic, political, and social rights. So that's some of the preliminary conclusion on the basis of this research. With some of the references I used for this presentation, particularly for the theoretical part of the presentation, and then also for the empirical side, including our work and the work I mentioned on elderly migrants and the work on highly skilled. I should also mention that students was also fertile sample for looking at mobility patterns, and particularly I just concluded cost action dealing with study abroad, and I was lucky enough to get a short-term scientific mission in a Southern European university in France, in Catalonia, in Perpignan, and looking at the mobility patterns of master students of different nationalities, including local students, and the way they also do, they also provide interesting evidences when it comes to transnational mobility, transnational migration, and second language acquisition in this regard. So merci. That's it. So I was on time, I guess. And I just give the floor back to the chair and
chair and discussant today. Thank you very much, Paolo. It was very clear.
I cannot see you.
Oh, perhaps you have to.
I need to move on because
take the share screen off.
Yeah, that's what I'm going to do now. Okay. Yeah.
So now you can see me?
Yes, I can see everybody, but at least the one who are still alive.
So again, thank you very much for this presentation, Paolo. It's a presentation that adds many elements to this discussion we have since around 20 years about the mobility turn. Perhaps if you take off your micro would be easier than for the echoes. So thanks. The mobility turn in the research in social sciences in general. It was John Ury that talked about this necessity to change completely the perspective if you work on topics related to social sciences in general. So this mobility turn concerns not only migration studies, that's very important, but nothing can no more be analyzed without the mobility perspective, mobility of humans perspective. That's the strong point John Ury has made at the beginning of this century. I think that we have today to include this idea of mobility and no more this classical view of migration, sedentarization, and then we wait the generations to assimilate to a place like it was in the old migration research. We have to add this transversal perspective of mobility, of human mobility to all research, like we do it in this moment with the question of gender. For instance, or the question of sustainability or environmental issues. So we have today this, at least these three systematic present elements of analyzing our society. I would add one to these three, which is more and more important too, and I will ask you what you think about that, which is the digital turn. So the way it's a fourth dimension, a certain way that is can no more be absent from our research. And I found nothing about that in your paper. And I think we have to discuss transnationalism and mobility with this perspective of digitalization that permits many things more that wasn't possible before. But I will return on this point in some minutes. I have some very easy points to discuss with you. If we adopt a historical perspective, we have the period after the Second World War in which migrants were called foreigners or guest workers, for instance. And the situation was really a 0-1 situation in the sense that the guest worker returns. He has not to be here in our place in Switzerland. This was the strange worker, Fremdarbeiter, the terminology, which is more aggressive as guest worker, because guests receive hospitality, but strangers has to go when they are no more needed. But conceptual parallel to this guest worker or foreigner concept of migration, which was also important in the research in this period, was the term of assimilation. So you have to return at home in your origin, in your country of origin, or to assimilate. This was the alternative. At the beginning of the 1970s, the foreigner transformed in the public discourse, but also in the research practice, into a migrant. In the 70s, first steps in this new vocabulary, but clearly in the 80s, this was the main wording used in the research world, but also in the political and social world. And concept related to this word migrant was the concept of integration. And as we know today, integration was always and is today a very asymmetric way to read people arriving. Certainly they don't ask no more to be assimilated. It means like all others, but you can keep something which represents your identity, no problem, but you have to follow the rules. You have to enter in a way of living that is not in contrast with the ways of living of the majority society. So it was a small step from assimilation to integration. The question now I have to, my first remark in a certain sense to you is, after this mobility turn, what is the correspondence in terms of being included in a society? What can be the political and in particular the social science perspective on these new forms of belonging? How can we work on that? How can we call it that? And what would be a political approach to these new forms of mobility we are living today with all that what you have described? Certainly no more integration, and certainly no more assimilation, but what is this third new paradigm that we have to develop to handle people arriving in our cities in particular, but people arriving from one place to another? My second point is really concerns this fourth dimension I described at the beginning. Today, we are working with concepts like hybridity to analyze the living conditions of people and multiple belongings, like you have described that. And it's clear that your network of contacts, our network of contacts, I think all people here has the same experience, are no more related to the neighbors. You can even say the neighbors are often not known, but you know better people living very far from you than people living near to you. So this hybridification of hybridity of your contacts, which are continuously, I would say, invested through social media, create a certain dilemma for territories. How can I ask somebody to be part of a collectivity, of a community, if he or she answers clearly, I'm already part of many communities, but without territory? And this social media element in migration studies is very important in the research in the last years. We have Manuela Nedelko, as you know, working on that here at the University of Geneva. We have Oana Ciobanu working on this social media dimension. And they say in a certain way, it's no more really an element relevant for your identity if you are in a mobility situation. So you can all the time live all the time what you like to live, and you have no more, in a certain sense, incentives to be part of a local collectivity. that means many things, and I think in particular it's a political question in the sense of political participation. If the territory is no more the relevant territory for you, what does it mean for your political territory? Where are you invested when you are in this kind of reality? From our research on youngsters, we see that they are more interested on international participation than on local participation, which is very, very nice and very, very important. Clearly for these young people, you have this with the Black Lives Matter movement. Even the feminist movement is globalized through this Me Too movement we have had. And at least, okay, but not last, the ecological movement which starts with solidarity to Greta Thunberg, which is in Sweden, which lives in Sweden. So you have something like a complete, with this, with what you describe, we have added with social media loss of territory, of loss of political territory. I would like to hear you about this hypothesis and how you see that. How can we engage people in the place they are living? Third point, it's a little bit outside point, but I want to introduce it with what we are doing in this moment in our studies in Africa and in Northern Africa in particular. We are analyzing migration there, and we are confronted with, not like colonialists going to them and saying to them what they have to say and to do, but we are confronted with a community of researchers who describe something like a way to today, a historical view in a certain sense, from the point of view of normality of circular migration in weak states until recently in a certain way. And now this transformation of this concept of circulation, which is no more really used. I was very happy to see it in your paper, this word circulation, but it was at the top of the kind of the research in North African studies in the countries we were, because the normality was circulation. And so today they change, and that brings me to my point. They talk about migration more and more. They have a migration plan for Africa, for instance, now adopted, which is a very, very interesting plan, because they want to have less borders for migrants inside Africa. And this contrasts a little bit the classical borders. But what I see is that the term migration is intrinsically related and motivated in the substitution to circulation by the reinforcements of the nation states. And here my question: if this way of reading you have is clearly no more central, the nation state is no more central in this kind of reading, are we facing a loss of power of the wealth of the nation states through these new practices of living a circular or a mobile world? And the nation state, has a concrete measures to change that? Is it something we have to accept as a good trend? And what is the other territory than we have as regulatory territory? I think certainly supranational instances will be more important in future, but also urban governments more than countryside governments in particular. But I will be interested to hear you about this point. The nation state, is it relevant today if you do migration studies? And this is for me a point which is related to that. The fourth point that I want to do, the last point I want to discuss with you. If this weakening of the nation state through higher mobility, worldwide mobility of high-skilled, certainly, but also enormously low-skilled people often undocumented people that are in cities like in Zurich, for instance, since some weeks able to access to a city card, something like an identity card for people that are not related to the territory in a formal way. Is this not a sign that we have to discuss more than about transnationalism, about translocalism? In a certain way, the networks that this migrant creates are not really marked by the national territory, but by places they have circulated and to which they have contacts, social contacts in particular, but often also political investments. And if I bring this point out, it means also that translocalism as a consequence of this mobility turn means also that cities are extremely important today, and urban citizenship in a certain way too. In other words, have we to think about migration and inclusion more in terms of urban dimensions than in terms of nation-state dimension, which is really outside this kind of thinking the people have today. Yes, these are my 4 points, and I would be happy to hear a comment about that from you, Paolo. Micro.
Yeah, thank you very much. I forgot my microphone deactivated. These are very important. These are very important and big points. I was saying that I took a number of notes while you were talking on some of the key concepts that you have been raising and pinpointing. One issue before answering the let's say 3-4 points was about the digital dimension. I don't know if I gave it for granted or if I did not emphasize it enough, but when I mentioned it, the transnational practices, either mobile or virtual practices, this is clearly at the forefront of a lot of research, and some of the findings we collected out of, for instance, the Bulgarian-Switzerland, the Bulgarian-Swiss, research. So what I meant in terms of mobility is not only physical mobility, but obviously virtual mobility. And there was also the paradigmatic part of that you mentioned it, John Henry. It was the paradigmatic part of the era stressed already 20 years ago by scholars thinking about transnational migration. When I think the dimension, the digital dimension, as you were also referring to, social media increased it even more afterwards. So there was just a clarification on the issue. Whenever was the issue, again, before the question, you made also references to transnationalism on one side, integration on the other side, using the assimilation framework. And this is, as I stressed it, where current research is going, particularly thinking about the time of migration passed by, and particularly looking at transnational communities, or also diaspora and the kind of practices they do. And looking also at the issue of the youngster and the second generation, on which I will come back later on. And so your first question was, what is the correspondence of being incorporated in a society I think that which is also very much related to the second question, which raises the issue of hybridity. And on this, we can say, on the basis of empirical research, that generally speaking, peoples tend to be local and international at the same time. Particularly, I mentioned students as a mobile person, and this is quite clear also in the kind of practices they do and the kind of transnational practices that they run. So one thing does not really exclude the other. And that also results into different forms of belonging and different forms of hybrid identity being currently developed. Obviously, as I stressed in my presentation, there are clearly differences between different categories of migrants, between highly skilled and low skilled, for instance. And the way for circulation is a kind of strategy for the low skilled. And when you talking about the normality of circular migration in Africa, I think there probably should be a lot to say about migration in Africa. A lot has been said about migration out of Africa by different scholars, also trying to tackle the issue of another myth, not the myth of return, but the myth of invasion, for instance, as stressed by Indeas. But all these scholars, even Oliver Backwell, reminds us about the importance of internal migration in Africa as well. And this is not, as a matter of fact, something new, but it's not something that happens wholeheartedly, but still it's an important part of the component in statistical terms of migration into the African continent. We always think about the so-called free movement inside the European Union and so on, but we also need to think about other kind of binding treaties and binding agreements that allows, that are attempting to allow mobility inside the African continent, for instance, as well. Particularly in the Southern Hemisphere, think about South Africa as an attractive spot for different categories, or what is going on between the Horn of Africa and the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, for instance. We talk about migration in between Somalia, Eritrea, Yemen, and so on. So, so there are more examples on the issue of mobilities inside the African continent, about the issue of my example went to circular migration between former colonies in kind of trading network fashion to Algeria and France, for instance. Then I think one great question was also what you said, Sandra, about are we really facing a loss of power from the side of the nation states, and what kind of our territorial dimension we should think about. Here there are, and when you also introduced it at the end of the translocal dimension, as I mentioned before, this is already something interesting for different categories of mobile people who are in itself translocal. They are local and at the same time international, when you think about international students, for instance. But when asked, I'm talking about French students, for instance, where they see their future, and no matter the enrichment that they have through transnational intercultural practices, in terms of also language practices, at the end, they say that they're thinking about getting a job as, for instance, teachers in their home country. So this brings us back to the local and to the local dimension, to their local sense of belonging as well. obviously, this is a paradigmatic case of a specific region with a high level of regional identity where I was running this piece of research. But coming back on the nation states, I think the nation states is alive and kicking, particularly during this day, and has been trying to really get hold and to control some kind of these practices, some kind of transnational practices. This is not nothing, and this is not only from the side of the receiving countries, but also particularly from the side of the sending countries. I mentioned in the case of Turkey and Germany, and the attempt from Erdogan's side to use the electoral power that the Turkish community in Germany can bring to him, so to consolidate his power. And this is clearly an example where nationalism and the nation state is actually trying to strike back and put into discussion issue at the supranational level. It's very difficult nowadays to talk about the supranational reality as the typical supranational reality is the European Union, when at the moment the pendulum, talking about Ellen Wallace and her model of between the national and the supranational level, is actually swinging back, is switching back to the national level. So the nation states at the end of the day is alive, but in one way, and that's what is good also from the transnational perspective that you kindly enlarge it, they cannot really control transnational practices, and not only migration. You mentioned it, and I stress it, that transnational and transnationalism is something that has broader meaning, not only migration. And for instance, if we think about the social protest movement as the Fridays for Future or Occupy Wall Street, these are transnational phenomena from the bottom, from below, that cannot really stop it by nation states, no matter how the nation states can try to do that. Or some resistances, if you think about the, in Europe, about Belarus, and the way, particularly some leading figures, not by chance female, also tackled or trying a little to tackle the authoritative powers of Alexander Lukashenko. And this is another example of kind of resistances from below, which actually acquired a transnational dimension in a connected world, even more in time of pandemic. On the other side, if we think about the COVID-19 era, there is also an attempt from the nation state to gain, to use somehow the pandemics also to regain power and to control mobility, for instance. This is clear, and everybody, basically every single nation state, do whatever feel more convenient for controlling the mobility and movement of people, using clearly the pandemic as an opportunity to switch back to that dimension of control you clearly indirectly mentioned in your remark. And on undocumented people, I'm very keen on that. In particular, I'm very keen on what's going on in also in Switzerland at the local level, because we have a collection of good empirical cases coming from different cities and so on. And how far undocumented are connected, well, this is clearly an issue. And obviously IT also play a good role here in terms of exchanging information and so on between, and this exchange of information between undocumented migrants and so on goes even beyond the local level and allows coexistence of the local and the international dimension that I mentioned before when I was talking about the students and students and mobility, encompassing the two dimensions and not excluding one or the other. So the nation states, no matter its prerogative, has to come to terms with some of these social protest movements, which are typical of, and the environmental dimension is also very important, that you also raised it. I could not cover everything, but obviously environmental migration, climate migration is another important issue. And also protest connected with claim for different environmental agenda are also fall also into the transnational movement we mentioned. So I hope that I, in one way, replied to some of your suggestions, which were very good, particularly if we think about the coexistence of patterns of transnational migration, transnational mobility with incorporation processes, and how to come to terms with both, and then the nation state and the supranational dimension. And the importance of thinking also from the bottom, which is what was, I could not show you a slide showing the different approaches from international relation to transnational to the transnational approach, and making kind of typologies and categories when we look at different social phenomena. And these are issues done already by, for instance, Rainer Baubock, some very good conceptualization of political transnationalism.
Thank you, Paolo. Simply to replace shortly, there is one point that for me is important when you talk no more about migration and international migration. If you talk about translocal migration and not, and you, the word international in a certain way is nation state, relevant for nation state. But mobility today is also from north of China to south of China, is from Zurich to Geneva, and from Geneva perhaps then to Milan. So you have mobilities which are inside countries with the same characteristics of this, the characteristic of mobile people.
Again, Sandro, I totally agree. I've been devoting some good side of my lecture also to the issue of internal migration. I'm glad that you raised the issue of China because, for instance, if we think that nowadays we have, and these are estimations, according to the United Nations definition, so we fall into the normative framework. But anyway, as you know, it's so difficult to have harmonization of statistics. And anyway, there is a definition that says that an international migrant is somebody living outside his own country for at least 1 year. And there is this distinction, 1 year or not, and so on and so forth. But so according to, and obviously in this category, we have plenty of different people falling into, even retired migrants, students, migration, and so on and so forth. But anyway, according to the last UN estimation, we have 248 millions of international migrants. The same can we say that, for instance, if we look at China, if we look at internal migration in China, which is not a novelty as well, because also the patterns of migration inside China are changing as well. It's not anymore rural-urban migration towards the Yangtze region and the Pearl River area, where not by chance IT businesses, multinational IT businesses are located. There is a very good movie that I would recommend to have a look at. It's a documentary, 60 minutes, done by a couple of researchers from the University of Venice, Katowskari, and it's about dream work, China, and it's about the aspiration. It was done 10 years ago, think about it, and we were already looking at patterns of internal migration, rural urban migration, particularly affecting low-skilled people, sometimes not highly educated, and going to work in IT companies in the Liance area. And they were interviewed, and you see their aspiration, their dreams, and the kind of life they are running in terms of exploitation as well, because they work 10 hours and even more a day. And then what is interesting is that there is no matter as kind of first sector, as more civil society, which is growing, made of NGOs trying to also to defend these people who are completely unaware of any kind of legislation and their rights as workers and so on and so forth. Just an example, when the Chinese, obviously before the pandemic, so once again, when the Chinese New Year's come, there is a mass movement of persons inside China going back home from the coastal area, for instance, back to, and this is widely recorded even from correspondents from the New York Times and so on. And it's an incredible movement of people. But anyway, internal migration in China has been also rather changing. And there are now big cities, and in the years to come also big cities that are becoming attractive spots for this kind of movements. So it's not anymore like rural, urban, low-skilled migration, but there are a variety of flows going there. So this to say that we have international migration, but we have internal migration as well, as we have south-south migration, which is relevant as south-north migration is, and it's not well known. If you look at the figures from UNHCR of sending and receiving countries of refugees, for instance, as far as receiving countries, Germany is the only one showing up after the Wir schaffen das policy, the changing policy implemented by Ms. Merkel. But basically, we have a lot of misconception about, and the majority of refugees are in fact in the southern hemisphere and not in the northern hemisphere. And there are a number of countries, even if we think about the Syrian crisis, the first movements went to a number of neighboring countries, including Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan. 5 million people went there. And then at the top of the Balkan, the so-called Balkan crisis, which was called migrant crisis, which is completely wrong. It's actually refugees, because the majority were actually, 2/3 were asylum-seeking person. And and then it was a secondary movement toward Europe. But first instance, most of these people were in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. Then we have that win-to-win agreement between Turkey and the European Union. And the European Union was in difficulties when relocating, resettling something like 160,000 migrants, whereas comparing to the numbers I mentioned, it was really a teeny number comparing to the results and the outcome of the Syrian conflict from 2011. And then many other issues related to this contest. So it was basically a European Union crisis and not so much. And again, we come to the criticism on the way the supranational dimension is not able anymore or as serious difficulties in facing all these processes. Also because obviously the resurgence of nationalism in a number of countries inside the EU. And this is really a paradox of history if we think about the Balkan crisis, because we have countries that in the past sent refugees and migrants all over the world, the Visegrad country particularly, and they closed their borders in 2014-15. particularly to migrants with a Muslim background coming from Syria, Afghanistan, and so on, and trying to rebuild a kind of Christian Europe, as the discussion before on the German migration landscape at the end of the 90s, at the beginning of 2000. So I went a little bit too far, but just to say that I think it's good also to see the contradiction of the different level playing from the local level you mentioned and the translocal dimension. Obviously, when you're talking about translocal dimension, you also mentioned the transborder movement somehow, no? You were mentioning movements between, for instance, Milan and Zurich. And also there is this epos of the brain drain, which is also a part of the story. If we think about that some of them are also low-skilled, using chain migration and trying to get through relative and friends in Zurich. And so, I mean, the guest worker model somehow is over, but south-north migration is not over at all. 150,000 people left Italy in 2060, and not all of them are highly skilled. Obviously, there are many highly skilled, but still. The characteristic of this flow also changed comparing to the guest worker era that you mentioned at the beginning of your intervention. So many issues. And with a transnational or translocal future.
Thank you, Paolo, for this feedback. If you have questions now on the floor to Paolo, it's open to all now. I'm simply on hearing you, all these categories. I think we have to reinvent words or to recreate something that permits us to have something like a general wording that you can then certainly decline in all these varieties you have explained. Typically, how to call migration, it's no more the right word. So have you to talk about interlocal mobile people, which would be preciser than this, and then say, okay, this interlocal, transnational, interlocal, translocal, no, over border, I don't know what, or even it was very nice some days ago as Angela Merkel talked about her integration program, the national one. She used a word that I have never heard to describe what is really contested, the word of a migrant background. Typically, migrant is bad as a word, and background is strange as a word. And she used the word of histories of migration, people with history of migration.
Yeah.
And I would say it can even go further and saying something like, we use normally experiences. So to not have this word of background or others. So that means mobility experience, people with mobility experiences. That means also histories in the households related to migration, etc., etc. But I think we need today to make an effort concerning the wording of our field, because what we use is always false. It's not right. If you say migration, it's not really circularity. If you say migration and it's transborder movements from border movements, so it's always something else, and we need, I think, to invest in a more a new conceptualization out of the wording. But okay, I want to open the floor, but Paolo, if you want to react to that, feel free.
No, shortly. I think sometimes with conceptualization we go even too far. Right? Anyway, you use the typical example of Germany, because this is the division between a newly arrived person and people with migrant background, which is So we need always also to think about, and here the nation states play the game. We need to think about the history of migration of different countries, trying to harmonize somehow their policies. And here the difficulties come on the surface, not only on the statistical terms, as I stressed it before. So if I think there is a kind of a hysteria going on, if you think about super diversity, or nowadays we talk also about reverse migration. If you think about Portuguese people, highly skilled, going back to the former colonies in Africa, in Mozambique, or in Brazil, looking for job opportunities in, for instance, in emerging countries with the GDP growing, although still emerging countries. So there are different way scholars and are trying to make conceptualization of this issue. Sometimes probably we go even too far, and this is something that we need to keep into account.
We have something to discuss, Paolo.
Yes.
Other questions? Are there remarks from the participants, from this small group of participants? Sabrina, please.
Sabrina.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting presentation, and a lot of things came into my mind. Good. But I have especially one question regarding the patterns you mentioned in transnational migration and the return practices. Yeah. Did you observe any differences between social policy in the country? Social policies and also the opportunity of being a citizen in the country of where the people come. I mean, is a difference for people without a legal status, like European Roma community, like you mentioned, or yeah, are there different trends, and is this sometimes some forced return due to those policies or something like that? Yeah, it's not really clear, but
okay. No, thank you. I think I got the point. And yeah, I mentioned it, Bulgarians when I was talking about the Roma. I could also mention from the former research on elderly migrants, I was running an interview in a small fieldwork in Serbia, also as far Roma from Serbia, because the connection with Sweden was obviously because of historical reason, and with Switzerland as well. Both countries are receiving countries for flows coming from the Balkans, particularly. So there was a rationale behind the selection of countries. And obviously here, Sabrina, there is a dividing line between those who are EU citizen and those who are not. So inequalities are also playing in this matter. And even if they are, let's say, EU citizen, they can be somehow they can use mobility possibility, but obviously because of their class and because of their education, they can be no matter discriminated against. For instance, in the first round of the EU enlargement, there was no issue because Poles were quite well known. They have an historical tradition of migration to the UK island, and particularly to Great Britain. And we think also about the Second World War and the free Polish government in London and so on. So there was a first flow of Poles, and then they had a reputation. So here we fall into the ethnicization of the labor market and so on. So there was no, and then the economy at the time was also running well. I'm talking about the UK economy. In the second round, 2017, there were no this kind of connection, and Bulgarian and Romanians were not as welcomed as before. Also, the political climate and the economic climate changed. Britain was not doing as well. Labour were not on power anymore, but anyway, mobility restriction applied at the time. You should always remember that several EU countries has been using restriction and transnational arrangement for different categories of. And this was not the case in 1995 when, for instance, Austria, Sweden, and Finland joined in the European Union. So again, inequalities, a different appreciation of the, obviously, the free country I mentioned, brought to the Union social legislation and social policies, as you were talking about social policies, welfare policy, which were a blueprint, particularly as far as Sweden, at the time, 1995, for the EU. And obviously there was no problem in thinking about any movement of Swedish people abroad inside the EU. The same cannot be said when the big enlargement of 2004 took place, and then in 2007 when Romania and Bulgaria joined. So there are a lot of side effects, and the impact of policies is quite well studied. And I'm afraid there are different attitudes according to the different categories of migrants. And that was also my last message when I was making comparison at the end of my book and today presentation about the differences between highly skilled and even second generation highly skilled and who are instead who are low skilled, who are somehow trapped in circular movements because of the legislation, because of policy, and because it becomes a way to surviving, to keep also, and to providing form of subsistence, money for their households at all. So, yes, there are dividing lines on the issue of citizenship.
Thank you.
Different. Yeah.
So thank you. We are arriving at the end of this meeting today. If there is a remark from someone, we have 2 minutes. It seems not. So I would like to thank you again, Paolo, for this presentation and for the small but nice group that followed it. It will be on YouTube, so we have the possibility to have a larger public there. And I hope they will, people will have a pleasure to hear you, even in this other form that is now at disposal. We will meet next week together again, and it is right. Blaise, what is the meeting of next week?
Je n'ai pas. Non, nous n'aurons plus de. We won't have any déjeuner sociologique until April. So the next one will be on the 15th of April with Solène Gouilliers et Loïc Riom. About un logiciel pour fabriquer de l'éthique, cadrage et débordement dans dispositifs d'aide à la rédaction des documents d'information.
Okay. So on my side, I also want to thank you everybody for listening to me, and Sandro and also the other participants for the thoughtful point which were raised. And I'm very glad that thanks also to the technology this was possible. Otherwise, things have got a bit more complicated.
Thank you to all, and see you soon. I hope tomorrow, Sabrina and others today, I think. Bye-bye.
And thanks also to Blaise.